series contains depictions of violent assault and murder. Listener discretion is advised.
The call came in just before 1:30 a.m. on January 27, 1974, saying, "I believe there might be a dead person on the beach across from Utah Street. If you follow the street right down to the water," the caller told a San Francisco police dispatcher. Didn't give his name, just hung up.
The call was made on the night of January 27th, 1974.
Yes, I believe there might be a dead person on the beach at right across from Ulloa Street. I just wanted to let somebody know, maybe needs help or something. But government my duty to report it.
Cops rushed down to Ocean Beach, scoured at the water's edge about to wash out by the waves, was a man's body. They dragged him back onto dry sand and took a close look. Seemed to be about 50 years old, balding, heavy-set, 17 stab wounds front and back, including on his hands. He tried to fight off the killer. There was no immediate ID on the dead man, and no one had any idea who the caller might have been. Though he sounded young, maybe he was just a witness, maybe he was something more. Nobody knew it that morning, but San Francisco had a new serial killer. He was given the name in the LGBTQ+ community and the news media because he was known to draw sketches of the men in the city's bursting bars and cafes before inviting them to join him in out-of-the-way places for sex.
Between 1974 and 1975, San Francisco was victimized by one of the most prolific killers of gay men in modern history. He preyed on people in queer neighborhoods across the city, in the Tenderloin, Polk Gulch, and the Castro. He went to gay bars, places with disco music blasting and men dancing. They say this killer watched them, maybe while leaned up against the bar or sitting in the corner of the room. He'd pick someone, then he would draw, sketching their portrait on a cocktail napkin. Once he showed that man their picture, they were his. The killer would tell his target that he wanted to go somewhere more private. They'd leave the crowded bar behind, and the next morning, the man he had sketched was dead.
There have been serial killers before and since, but this one wasn't like the others. The Doodler snared his victims with his sketches. By all accounts, a good-looking young man with real artistic skills. He strolled into one of the bars, pick a mark, knock out a quick sketch of a man, show him the doodle, flattered him, suggested they peel away for sex. The next day, the victim turns up dead on a beach or in a park, savagely knifed and slashed over and over. Rage killings, always in the spot known for gay hookups. These poor 5 souls the Doodler is confirmed to have killed, and others who may have felt his blade got no justice. Gerald Kavanaugh had left home young and did a 21-month hitch with the U.S. Army at the end of World War II. If he was out about being gay, his family wasn't in on it. He went home once a year to visit his mother until she died in 1967. After that, he never returned.
On the beach at right across from Ulloa Street.
Just 2 days before Zodiac's last letter, the body of Gerald Earl Kavanaugh was found on the morning of January 27, 1974, lying along the water's edge of Ocean Beach. Born in Canada, the 49-year-old worked as a fitter in a mattress factory, but little else was known about him. He had tried to fight his attacker off but was unsuccessful, dying from 17 stab wounds. The murder was quickly added to the growing number of unsolved homicides in the city. It was not until June 24th that year that the killer struck again.
I sort of put two and two together, and well, I have a pretty good idea why he was in San Francisco, said his great-nephew.
Most people in San Francisco at the time never even heard about the Doodler. His murders weren't headline news. They were missed by the mainstream media, relegated to the back pages of the San Francisco Chronicle. The Doodler didn't even make it into the paper by name until January of 1976, well after his last victim was identified. The question is, why?
There was a lot of stuff going on. There was Zebra, there was Zodiac, there was Doodler, so there were a lot of mysterious, random murders.
I feel like it was overlooked, maybe just because it had to do with the gay population.
People were getting mugged, people were getting harassed, people were getting beaten. And the Doodler took it to another level, is that he was killing people and getting away with it because the police didn't, to be honest with you, care.
And the Doodler took it to another level. And that he was killing people and getting away with it. And the police didn't even care. In the end, it just wasn't big news, even though the LGBTQ life was pushing out of the closet and into the public consciousness.
47 years since the Doodler lurked in San Francisco. And it might seem strange that a prolific murderer went unnoticed for so long, but police at the time didn't have all the information, tools, and context at our disposal today.
First, the Golden State Killer, and now there is word of a potential break in the case of another serial killer who terrorized the Bay Area.
He was nicknamed the Doodler because the serial killer sketched each of his victims before killing them.
In 2019, the SFPD held a press conference announcing they were actively pursuing this case. They released an updated sketch of what the Doodler may look like today. I was there at that press conference.
We know that in the 1970s, this was gripping the gay community in San Francisco. And so Inspector Cunningham reopened all the cases that were involved at that time to see if we could identify who that is so that we could get closure for those victims and hopefully make an arrest in those cases.
That all ended on June 25th, 1974. His given name was Joseph, and that's how he was listed on the police report when his body was found beside a tree at Spectacle Lake by a woman out for an early morning stroll.
Noted as
in
having
Golden
been a
Gate
bit of a
Park.
sensation when she first took the stage around 1966 as an impersonator of female singers, and even won the San Francisco Best Actor Award, but had since switched to focus more on gay comedy. The summer of '74 was her beginning at Finocchio's. It was just before midnight on the 24th when a woman living near the Golden Gate Park reported hearing screaming coming from inside the darkness. The next morning, someone walking their dog discovered the body of 27-year-old Jay Stevens. The attack appeared to have taken place on the trail around Spreckles Lake, and the victim was pulled into the brush here where she was stabbed 5 times, 3 of which were in the heart, and then robbed. At 1,017 acres, Golden Gate Park is the largest park in the entire city. It is dotted with numerous landmarks, monuments, and even a bison sanctuary. It was believed that Jay had driven the killer to the park and they went for a walk. Several hours later, in the early dawn, Jay's car was spotted by police driving in an area that was known to have frequent rapes. They attempted to make a routine stop, but the driver sped off. A chase ensued until the car crashed into a house and the driver managed to escape.
In the 1970s, the second floor of 506 Broadway in San Francisco, North Beach, was home to Francesco's. where drag queen Jay Stevens performed. He'd last been seen at the Corbett Club in North Beach, where he'd once again wowed the crowd with his wisecracks, singing and dancing. Like Kavanaugh, he had been savagely stabbed, front and back, beaten so badly that his family was barely able to recognize his corpse. Stevens was the only Doodler victim to grow up in the Bay Area, so he was a little easier to research. Still, there wasn't much to go on. Jay Stevens was 27 when the Doodler stabbed him to death and left his body near Spectacle Lake in Golden Gate Park on June 25, 1974. Stevens is buried at the Memorial Garden Cemetery in Concord. Jay Stevens did a terrific Julie Andrews, and he was funny as hell. In 1974, he was a rising San Francisco drag queen, wowing crowds at the PS Lounge and the world-famous Fenicucci in North Beach. Melissa Stevens has a photo of her brother, Jay Stevens. Jay Stevens was this bright, young, I would guess in his early 20s, pretty boy. Longtime assistant to drag star Charles Pierce. A charming kid with makeup and hair and costumes and, the fake corset and all that. Looks weren't all, though. Stevens was a triple threat on stage. Great singer, dancer, and, as Frederick said, a really good stand-up comic in a dress. One of the late Bay Area reporters said that Stevens had a face that launched 1,000 sailors. High cheekbones, long wavy hair the color of straw, and eyes like a doe. Here's a twist. Turned out Stevens had a sister, Alma Stevens, who thought evil spirits had emerged from his murder 3 months after his death. She disembodied their mother and burned her in the family fireplace in Concord, then took a sledgehammer to his sister's head. We asked her to connect us with family over here. There were several names we'd seen in clippings from 45 plus years ago, but none of them had led anywhere. The sister survived. Alma ended up in an institution for the criminally insane. While there, she had a daughter. That daughter was the niece we found. Where was the sister who survived the sledgehammer? The niece contacted a brother of Stevens. He didn't want to talk, but the brother contacted the sister, and that's when we finally got an email. The sister's name was Melissa Stevens, and the story got even more twisted. 70 years old, hasn't talked about her brother in decades, hasn't talked to police since that day. She ID'd the body, but when I sat on her patio to peel back the paste, she lit up. Melissa Stevens keeps a portrait of her brother, Jay Stevens, in her home. They performed together until his death. Alma's institutionalizing process was involved and stressful. The trauma eventually driving away from the Bay Area, she came back only after her murderous sister died in 2004. Yes, Stephen did a terrific Julie Andrews, but he did a lot more. Not lip syncing either. His voice was electric honey. Sometimes Stephen did comedy solos, sometimes in a trio. If he'd lived, the sky would have been his limit, she said. In fact, she sang and danced with her brother and a comedian named Steve Miller, who was well known at the time, called themselves the Wonder Sisters. She was the female relief. She said with a laugh before singing a snippet of Baby Let the Good Times Roll. She said, I miss him to this day. I've had a good life, but I would like to have had Joe's case solved. I think it was just pushed aside. You know, another gay, unworthy person murdered, you know. Soon after the sledgehammer attack, and after Alma Stevens was arrested, their father burned to death in an office fire. She purged her lips. What's with this guy? Is he around? Is he alive? This Doodle guy? Little did she know, and me as well, at least then, the answers to that question was probably yes. The journey was just beginning. They still needed to find relatives of victims in Washington State, Sweden, and Germany. They might have clues, and we didn't find them. They need to pinpoint survivors of the Doodle attacks, and they were indeed survivors. They did just that. Will we find the Doodle himself? That remains to be seen. For now, I can say we found many unexpected things, including a ripple from that half-century-old cluster of murders, a ghost. Bought the house from the Stevens family after the murders. They were among the first people I talked to when I was trying to find Stevens' survivor. We know what happened in this house, and I'm sad for that family, but it doesn't bother us to live here. The mother's ghost is still here. Doesn't freak us out. She's a shadow that appears every once in a while. When I leave the house, I say, take care of everything, and she's always been good, never bothers us. Claus Craftsman wanted a new start. San Francisco in 1974 was just the place. It was hip. It was in America, land of opportunity. It had a vibrant and growing gay population. He liked that scene. Back home in Germany, the 31-year-old craftsman had managed a bar that catered to both gay and straight customers. That April, Craftsman flew out to visit an American buddy he'd met while the friends were pulling an army hitch in Germany. He came to San Francisco to achieve something better for himself and his family. Craftsman's daughter said, many people thought that in America, pretty much anything is possible, and you can achieve much more. That dream ended on July 7th, 1974, on Ocean Beach. Craftsman's nearly decapitated corpse was found that morning, near where the body of another man had been discovered nearly 6 months before. He'd been stabbed 15 times front and back, another rage killing. Craftsman had last been seen at the Bojangles Gay Dance Club in the Tenderloin the night before, a Saturday. The beach was a popular gay hookup spot. Everything about his murder screamed Doodler. Was there anything we could see here all these years later to better understand what happened? Cunningham recounted what he knew from the police files. Compared to the Doodler's other victim, he said, there was a lot more stab wounds. There was a struggle. There was a lot of blood. He didn't linger on the description. He had taken it from the main cop who rode to the scene that day, bow tie wearing homicide inspector David, who held the initial investigation and who died 2 years later. He said that was probably the most horrific crime scene he had been to. That guy had seen a lot of crimes. He had seen a lot.
Is Dan Cunningham, an investigator with the SFPD.
At some point, when the police got there, the tide was rising, and his body was getting hit by the tide.
To police in the 70s, right away it was clear that this was a murder victim. The San Francisco Examiner identified him 2 days later, towards the back, on page 42. Here's Dan Cunningham.
Gerald Kavanaugh, who was a Canadian man, 49, 50 years old.
The paper said that Gerald Kavanaugh was a furniture finisher. Whoever killed him had stabbed him 17 times in the chest, the back, and the stomach. 17 times. The article didn't include much other information. In fact, it was soliciting leads. Police provided a phone number for readers to call.
So there's people that are out there that were terrified when they started bringing it back up again and talking about it. It was almost like they didn't want me to come by and talk about it because all these feelings came back up again.
Turns out the woman who found Craftsman's body was hardened too. She's 95 now. I found her in a place finder database we used at the Chronicles. Age has not fuzzed her memory. I asked her if she was shocked when she stumbled across a corpse at 6 a.m. while walking her German Shepherd. A body is a body, she said. Oh, I replied, you've seen a lot of bodies? Young man, I lost 6 brothers and a sister. My parents, I know death. A body is a body.
70s, San Francisco was just becoming a mecca for gay men. If you were gay in Omaha, Nebraska, or Birmingham, Alabama, you were in danger. Gay men were portrayed as sexual deviants, pedophiles, and criminals. Identifying yourself as gay was extremely risky, even to loved ones.
What is the worst incident that has ever happened to you since you've been gay, as far as being gay?
I guess my parents, them finding out was the worst.
People came to San Francisco from other parts of the country because they were gay and because they felt like they could be themselves here and that they could start a new life and not be closeted.
That's Anne Cronenberg. She was active in the gay liberation movement and worked for activist and icon Harvey Milk. LGBTQ wasn't even a term back then.
There was this freedom if you were in San Francisco and, anything goes. It was like sex and drugs and you had the bathhouses and the bars were just overflowing and dancing. It was just such a fun time.
There were entire neighborhoods where you could be surrounded by gay people. Bars by the dozens all around. The summer of love was over, but the hippies were still living like it was 1969.
Time of great liberation and electricity.
That's Tom Amiano. He's a longtime gay activist, a former San Francisco supervisor and state assemblyman.
We had a lot of the civil rights movement, the gay movement, the peace movement, the women's movement. There's a lot of shit happening.
The politics and social activism of the 60s and 70s were momentous.
Less than 2 weeks later, another woman walking her dog on Ocean Beach, just across from the edge of the park, made a grisly discovery. German native Klaus Christmann arrived to the United States in April of 1974 in search of a better life for his family. He had come to San Francisco and was staying at the home of his friend Booker Williams and working at a Michelin tire store. Last seen leaving gay dance club Bojangles in the Tenderloin district, Christmann traveled across town to Ocean Beach, which was known to be a popular hookup spot for men in the bars. The murder this time was far more brutal. He had been stabbed repeatedly and his head was nearly decapitated. Responding Inspector Dave Tashi of Zodiac fame described the crime scene as the most horrific he had ever been to.
The man had been stabbed approximately 15 times. His throat had been slashed, his neck had been slashed, he'd been stabbed in the chest, in the abdomen, in the stomach, and in the back. His pockets had been torn out of his jacket. We found 1 penny in his pockets of his Levi's. And we still don't know who the man is. He's listed as a John Doe number 82 at the present time, and we're making an appeal to the public, through the television people here in the city, to see if they recognize this man's photograph, to contact us here in the homicide detail so we can find out who he is, where he came from, and just what he was doing out there just before he was killed.
Prime targets, gay men. They had to be on guard all the time, but still they came to the city as dangerous as it was. Revolving bands of teens routinely beat up gay people. It was better than other parts of America. San Francisco was a mecca where they could be themselves mostly. Still, it was 1974. Sodomy laws remained on the books. Cross-dressing was illegal. That law was finally overturned the same month Christmas was killed. By squads, busted gay men for being gay. Homicide detectives were consumed with the more notorious cases. Plus, the city's cops had no computers to cross-reference cases, no DNA technology to crack an arrest out of a database by matching samples. Just gumshoe with the instincts. You could have a case and the guy sitting right across from you could have a related case and you wouldn't even know it. In fact, it was a new kind of murder. Bodies in similar locations, killed in the same manner, over and over. That just wasn't something investigators were familiar with before the killers like the Doodler and the Zodiac showed up. The very concept of serial murders originated in the 70s. Keep in mind, if you go back historically with homicide, almost always a homicide was acquaintance perpetrated, that is, the offenders knew the victim. In the late 60s and into the 70s, there's like a new pitch in America, and suddenly you have killers, gunmen, stabbers, whatever, who are targeting victims for no apparent motivation. I mean, in other words, total strangers. The worst. The Zodiac left signs or mail bragging letters to the news media. All had defining techniques and haunted their prey intensely like the Doodler. You don't see the taunting of the police with the Doodler, but you do see a very efficient way of killing. I mean, very mythological. You know, with the doodling and all the trademarks of a very cunning serial killer. There were very few clues with Craftsman's slaughter, but looking back on them now, they were telling. The stabbing he suffered reflect focused fury, just like the murders of the Kavanaugh and the Stevens. He wore orange bikini shorts, carried a tube of makeup, wore several rings, handsome with cool sideburns and clothes, was known to frequent gay bars. But that's where the news clippings and police files ended, except to say Craftsman had been staying in San Francisco with a friend named Booker T. Williams, and that his wife and 2 kids were back in Germany. Booker Williams died in 2001. His widow, living back east, knew nothing. Others who might have known him had passed away, a common theme in this haunt. And we finally get our break. Diving into social media, we discovered a relative in Germany had requested records from the SFPD just 2 years ago and found Kreisman's widow and daughter in Germany. The widow didn't want to be involved. The daughter asked us to use an alias, so we chose Helen. The family learned in 1974 that Kreisman was murdered through a telegram from Williams. Sorry to tell you, Kreisman had died. A one-page death notice from the German consulate in San Francisco followed. A bit of communication with San Francisco police, that was it. Helen said her mother lost hope fast. They told her right from the beginning that there was very little chance that the perpetrator would be found at all because there are so many murders. Kreisman was working for the Michelin Tire Company when he was slain, she said, and through cops here had pegged him as gay. There's no doubt about that in the police files on his killing. Helen wasn't so sure. He was an attractive, well-groomed man, she said, and yes, carried makeup. Might have been unusual back then, but from 6,000 miles and 46 years away, she thinks assumptions that her father was gay are a lie. Her mother never thought he was gay, but she did tell Helen that she was a bit flustered when she went to that bar, the gay-friendly one, that he had managed in Germany, where he worked, when she was confronted with open homosexuality for the first time. I think she was a little surprised and overwhelmed by it. It was another time, another generation. I was raised to be completely open towards homosexuality. I have no problem with that. Maybe that's why I didn't believe there's much truth to this presumption. In other words, from her modern perspective, she saw no reason to think that just because her father worked at a gay-friendly bar in the 1970s that he was gay himself. All interesting, but not getting us anywhere near to understand where he had been, who had been hanging out with, or whether he'd picked up any warning signs of the end that was awaiting. What we were beginning to understand, though, was that the fear of a murderer walking free nearly half a century ago carried through to this day, not just the victims' survivors who were still so rattled they didn't want to be named or participate in our hunt, but in anyone who was gay and remembered the horror. It put the shivers to everybody. I mean, everybody heard about it, and nobody had any substance, you know. Those shivers were about to explode. Just as everybody feared, the Doodler wasn't done. Every time Davia Ashton left a gay bar in 1975 with his puffy blonde wig and baba boom strap-on breasts, he was a target. Passing thoughts taunted, cops hassled. A drag queen in an era of blossoming gay rights knew it came with living out loud and proud. So did terrifying attacks, like the time he went home with a kinda cute guy he met over drinks and wound up tied up like a pig on my stomach with my hands behind my back, Ashton recalled. He held a knife to my throat, and I thought, oh boy, this is it. Ashton wiggled free, fled when the attacker was out of the room. He knew how lucky he was, because the other thing that came with being gay in the mid-1970s was assaults and murder, even in an open-minded San Francisco. 2 of Ashton's gay friends had been stabbed to death by men they had stolen away with for sex. One was Jay Stevens. He and Ashton had shared the stage in a drag show where Stevens was the bigger star. What happened to him was such a tragedy, Ashton told me. What happened to Stephen was a serial killer who would become known as the Doodler, June 1974, alongside Golden Gate Park, Spectacle Lake. That's where his life ended. I admired him, so talented, Ashton said softly in an interview last year. Puffy blonde wig and sparkling silver dress arranged perfectly. He spoke while getting ready for the spotlight at Aunt Charlie's Drag Bar in the Tenderloin. He closed his eyes, remembering for a moment, then, with a shake of his shoulders, he brightened and headed for the stage. Got a show to do, he said briskly. By May 1975, 3 men had fallen to the Doodler's blade, and though investigators haven't yet noticed a pattern, Ashton and his friends had. Worried whispers spread throughout the gay bar. Some deranged artist had been sketching people as a come-on, stabbing them to death at outdoor hookup spots. It was early. The Doodler's name hadn't even been coined. That would soon change with more blood on the sand. On May 12, 1975, the body of a 32-year-old man was discovered in the same Ocean Beach dune where Doodler's victim, Claus Kreisman and Gerald Kavanaugh, had been found in 1974. The corpse was at the foot of Vincent Street, stabbed 16 times, heart torn apart. Obvious rage killing like the others. He'd been dragged 20 feet through the sand. Maybe he'd struggled, just like Kavanaugh. He'd been seen at the gay dance bar, Bojangles, same place Kreisman was last spotted. Victim number 4 turned out to be Frederick Kappen. Small, at 148 pounds, but tough. Snappy dresser like Kreisman and Stevens. Rainbow patterned shirt, blue corduroy jacket. A Vietnam combat veteran and working nurse used to trauma. So he knew how to spot trouble and how to fight. The question was, did Kappen know his killer? The cops had no idea, but at least they saw the connections. New homicide inspector had been working the Doodle killings. Now they had 4 rage killings of gay men, all left at gay hookup spots alongside water, all last seen at gay bars where witnesses said a sketch artist was trolling for men. Police asked for a single team to start poking around, and they turned to the Soul Brothers. Brown was a lawyer, a state assemblyman, and like Guilford and Sanders, a civil rights pioneer. He got California's sodium law overturned in 1976. Later, as a San Francisco first black mayor, he appointed Sanders chief in 2002. They were great cops. Both were physical guys, football players in school who knew how to throw a punch when they had to. On the street, Guilford was the chatter one, nicknamed Officer Smiley. Sanders often toted a book around, so he was dubbed School.
From today's vantage point, 1970s San Francisco might have seemed as if it was a sexually freewheeling open city. Compared to most places in the United States, I suppose it was, but that freedom was not without complications and difficulties for the LGBTQ plus community. A decade before this series of murders, San Francisco was rocked by the organized financial shakedown of the gay and lesbian bar owners in the city that exploded into scandal. In February 1960, 9 police officers went on trial for their part in a sprawling payola scandal. Police would show up weekly for a cash payoff in exchange for looking the other way and ignoring laws on the books outlawing homosexual activities, such as dancing, touching, kissing. Homosexuality was illegal in the United States in the 1970s, and these and other poison pills were not so much constantly enforced laws, but often used as forms of coercion. Even after the payola scandal, the police could be found openly committing acts of violence against members of the gay and lesbian community. When he owned a shop in the Castro district, Harvey Milk wrote and published an account of two police officers who removed their badges and started a fist fight with patrons of a Castro bar in the middle of the street after the bars closed. In addition to all of those things, there was a rise in fag bashing, as it was called at the time, in San Francisco and across the United States in the 1970s. Often the police looked the other way. Harvey Milk and other gay Castro district business owners began to demand that the police take some action to protect their patrons after they left the bars. In response, the San Francisco Police Department became one of the first departments in the United States to form an undercover detail to arrest bashers. The police and the gay and lesbian community began working together to form some sort of bond with baseball games and other public civic activities. But the scars of homophobia were deep, and it would take much more than a few baseball games to penetrate the frost and fear that separated the police from the community.
Both guys were snappy. Even when they showed up at 3 in the morning, they had style. Suits, elegant ties. They'd all be decked out. They would come up to the scene, always super polite, really respectful to the patrol officers on the street, and they were right to the point. Here's what we need. And they got stuff done. They helped bust the zebra killers, who ranked up 15 bodies. The Soul Brothers crime clearance rate is about 90%. But then came the Doodler. There was little evidence at any of the murder scenes, mostly just clothing splattered with the victim's blood. Kin of the dead was hard to find. 3 of the first 4 victims were from out of state, 1 from Germany and another from Canada. And murderers targeting gay people were pretty frequent.
Capon, age 32, was discovered by a hiker behind the dunes that ran along the Great American Highway, also near Ocean Beach. The coroner's note said, quote, "There was dried blood smeared on the soles of both shoes, on the hands, about the face, and upper torso, anterior, lateral, and posterior." Like Stevens, Capon was moved 20 feet from where the initial attack had taken place. Capon had no identification and was identified through fingerprints on file due to his work as a nurse. According to Capon's obituary, he was born in Washington State. He served in the U.S. Navy from 1963 to 1969, where he worked as a medical corpsman. When he left the Navy, he worked as a nurse. Mr. Capon was the recipient of a Commendation Medal for saving 4 men under fire in the Vietnam War.
The city's small gay press covered many, but mainstream papers and TVs particularly ignored them. Assurance, if not an arrest, Sanders and Gifford brought it. All of a sudden, these bodies were showing up, said James Robinson, a bartender at the Fantasy and PS Lounge drag queen bar where Stevens performed. Now 85, he helped form the Tavern Guide in the early 1960s to combat harassment of small gay businesses by the authorities. With fear rising in the gay bars and neighborhoods, people needed reassurance. Everyone deserves justice. I always say, if one counts, they all count. And I mean it. But these Doodler homicides, they're just something extra about it. Captain's final resting place is nowhere near the Bay Area. His body was shipped north to relatives in Bremerton, Washington, for burial. The family didn't have any information to offer police, So there was little in the files all these years later beyond a reference to his Navy service and the details of his stabbing. But after private investigators and reporters started digging into old address records, we found where Captain had lived on 17th Street in 1975 and reached out to his old neighbors. They never responded. We wrote to the Navy for his war records, hoping for names of fellow sailors, none available. We had plenty of questions. What was Captain doing in San Francisco? Was he an artist? Maybe he knew the Doodler? Was he openly gay? They had not been able to find family beyond a quick contact with a sister who had died soon afterwards. Then we hit on a niece's name during a ancestry, address, and other database. It was like opening a treasure chest. Captain wasn't just a vet, he was a war hero. In 1965, as a Navy medical corpsman, he dragged 4 wounded Marines out of a combat zone while Viet Cong soldiers rained hail on them during the battle. Friendly fire shadowed his lower left leg. He was flown home to Washington to recuperate. A yellowed clippings from the Kitsap Sun newspaper, then the Bremerton Sun, quoted him describing how we fought all night. Captain was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for Valor. The photo in the Sun showed Captain with his wounded leg propped up, painting a picture. So yes, he was an artist, who was later murdered by an artist. Did that indicate maybe he knew his killer? We checked with local art schools to see if they had any records of Captain. Nothing. Relatives knew of no worrying connection between Captain and a fellow artist, but they did fill in some more of his picture. It wasn't pretty. Captain niece of Idaho told us that her late mother had been close with Uncle Fred before he was slain. The brother and sister would go lurking off on adventures around Washington State and leaned on each other for support, which they needed. Home life was awful. Drunken parents, abuse. Captain's mother once smashed a beer bottle on his face. The kids wound up shuffling through foster homes at schools. Captain was bullied. The Navy was a lifeline. It gave him a new start with medical training, and after his discharge, he ditched his home turf and headed for the West Coast gay mecca. San Francisco, became a nurse at the old St. Joseph Hospital next to Buena Vista Park, found an apartment in the Bangalogian Castro. I don't know. But something went wrong. Not long before he wound up dead on the beach, Captain told his family he had enough of the city. We were going down there to visit him in San Francisco, Captain's nephew explained, and Fred said, "Wait, don't come down here. It's getting dangerous down here. I'm going to go back. I'm going up north and I'm going to relocate to Washington."